So as Easter was approaching, Lent was descending. Um, my mind got thinking about Christ's descent into hell and a few things that I had learned when I was reading some of the Eastern fathers. Um, I think the way that the East portrays sin and death and um, articulates it within their theology is so vital for everybody to understand. Um, but also how it relates to literature that I read on a regular basis. And what I mean by that is there's this post that I was writing, and it I'll read it to you. It says, Christ's descent into hell was the ultimate bait and switch, an ambush of divine mercy that caught the devil completely off guard. This profound mystery hasn't gone unnoticed by the great storytellers. You see its echoes in Harry Potter, where sacrificial love shields the innocent, or in Aslan's willing death in place of Edmund, a deep magic, as C.S. Lewis called it, woven into the fabric of creation itself. This Easter, being reconciled to the King of Kings, the one who shattered the gates of hell with love stronger than death. And anytime I think about just some of the most basic things, Easter, Christ's death, descent, resurrection, ascension, these things, I'm like, oh yeah, these all like historical events. These things all happen. This is the core of Christianity. I often miss what Christ ultimately did. And actually, I'm just going to admit it, I didn't really even understand this until, in its full essence and full understanding of it, until I read the East and the West Fathers. Like, until I really dove into, got out of my Protestant thinking and got into this. And I know, this has nothing to do with Protestant theology or anything like that necessarily, just my own experience. So I wanted to kind of ask some of these questions that I have been going through, and I think you guys will find them interesting, and it will really hone in on what Christ did with death. And some of these questions obviously are like, well, did God create death? Was death natural? Is it just spiritual death? How can God defeat something he allowed? All these questions sort of rising up. And the first one, obviously, this bait and switch. Like, where does that come from? The horroring of hell. Saint Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century gives perhaps the most vivid version of this in the Catechetical Oration. I think it's chapter 24. I don't have the direct reference in front of me, but I have the quote. The deity was hidden under the veil of our nature, that so as with ravenous fish, the hook of the deity might be gulped down along with the bait of flesh, and thus the life being introduced into the house of death, and light shining in darkness, that which is opposed to life and light might vanish. This is exactly the bait and hook image. Christ's human flesh is the bait, but his divinity is the hidden hook. The devil seizes onto that, what he thinks is mortal man, and death is defeating what God sent, but is caught by God himself entering his realm, right? And another kind of caveat to this, of something I always forget, is both righteous and unrighteous people are where Jesus is going at the time, because this is Old Testament. This isn't the New Testament. Christ hadn't fulfilled these things yet. So, heaven as we know it today, in terms of the righteous and the refinement of that the moment of purgatory, or however you want to describe that, and becoming holy, it's not the same. It was not the same then. These things change as Christ does certain events. Saint Ephrem kind of compounds this. Death slew Christ by means of the body which he had assumed, but that same body proved to be the weapon that which he conquered death. The body which he had assumed from the Virgin he gave to the one who devoured him, like bait cast into the jaws of a wild beast. So how can God defeat death if he created it as a curse, right? This is the paradox that the fathers wrestled with. Death is a punishment for sin, Romans 6:23. And we know in Genesis that when they immediately died, it was spiritual death. It obviously wasn't physical death because they continued to live. And In Wisdom 1:13, it says, God did not make death, nor does he delight in the death of the living. St. Athanasius on the Incarnation says, it was unworthy of the goodness of God that creatures made by him should be brought to nothing through the deceit wrought upon man by the devil. It was impossible, therefore, that God should leave man to be carried off by the corruption, because it would be unfitting and unworthy of himself. Meaning, death, physical death, occurs because of a mercy. Now, we could get into that's a whole different video in itself, whether physical death was already in existence and part of God's plan, or if it's a mercy that occurred after the fall. God enters into death to destroy it from within, though. The Eastern tradition specifically, especially in Athanasius and Gregory and Maximus, sees Christ's death as a voluntary act of power. He uses death against itself. So, again, on the Incarnation, in chapter 20, he accepted death in order that he might thereby destroy death. So what Christ is doing, this is the unfolding thing that occurred in me, is realizing that death became the gateway to life. And we all fear physical death. Like, there's two things that people want. Actually, this is so funny because, again, it's all in the literature written by Christians. And Harry Potter, Gandalf, Dumbledore says there are two things that people want most, which is money and power, and the ability to live forever. And he says it's not good that something would ever give us that at our will, because we humans often chase that which is wrong for us. And so he's pointing to the fact that, like, eternal life in that way, and infinite money and power in that way is actually not good for us. Death becomes a means of life. This is that trigger that got me. St. John Chrysostom would put it this way: hell took a body and met God face to face. It took earth and encountered heaven. It took what it saw and was overcome by what it did not see. So, what did Christ defeat? And why did he go to hell? If he's now turning death into this incredible life-giving thing, what did Christ actually defeat? Christ did defeat death, the separation of the soul from the body, separation of humanity from God, the dominion of the devil over humanity in Hebrews 2:14. St. Athanasius writes on the Incarnation 2 chapters later, the body as an immortal thing died, but it was raised again because it had become the very temple of life. Christ, being life, conquered death by his own power. Christ didn't just die. He entered death voluntarily and destroyed its power from within. So why did Christ go to hell, or Hades, anyways? The Creed says he descended into hell, but hell means Hades, the realm of the dead, not the place of eternal damnation, but the shadowy abode of all who have died, the righteous and the unrighteous of the Old Testament. And when I say the Old Testament, I just mean pre-Christ configuration. To proclaim victory is number one. So in 1 Peter 3:18-19, it says, he was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. This is echoed in St. Cyril of Jerusalem. He went down into the realm of the dead, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. He came to rescue Adam and all his descendants. And then number two, Christ went to Hades to liberate the righteous. The fathers speak of the harrowing of hell, where Christ burst the gates of Hades and rescued the souls of the just who awaited him: Adam, Abraham, David, the prophets, John the Baptist. St. Irenaeus says the Lord descended into the regions beneath the earth, preaching his coming and remissions of sins to those who believe in him, all the just men who lived before the law and under the law, hoping in the coming of Christ, received remissions of sins. This is God gathering his scattered children from death into the kingdom. He's saying, I'm going to come get you from where you're being held in that shadowy realm called Hades. Number three was to fulfill typology of Jonah and Samson, which we actually get a glimpse of when Jesus is speaking in Matthew 12. Just as Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish and Samson pulled down the gates of the Gaza, Christ enters the grave to break it from the inside. So this is, again, I think all summarized in their father, St. John of Damascus, puts it this way. He endured death to destroy death, and by his resurrection, he gave us life. That's in the exposition of the Orthodox faith. It's pretty incredible. Imagine death as a locked dungeon beneath the world. For all of humanity, every man and woman died, righteous or wicked, fell into that prison. Some sat in the darkness with a flicker of hope. Others cowered in chains. Others were bound. The gates were heavy, forged in Eden when Adam fell, and sealed with the curse. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. But then quietly, on a Friday afternoon, a strange man crucified outside Jerusalem. The world thought he was dying like everybody else. Hell thought so too. But they were wrong. What they didn't see, what death itself couldn't fathom, was that this was life himself, clothed in mortality. God had not come to weep at the gates of death. He had come to enter it. And when he did, something broke. Because of the first time in history, a sinless soul descended into death, not as a slave, but as a conqueror. The gates did not hold him. He passed through them as a fire through paper. Death tried to consume him, but it was like trying to swallow the sun. The belly of death turned to light. Christ didn't escape death. He rewrote it. He made it into a door. Where once death was an end, now it's a beginning of hope. Where once it was darkness, now it's flooded with the resurrection light. Where once it was a dungeon, now it is the path to the garden. You and I will still die, yes, but now, because of Christ, death is no longer a pit. It is a passage, a baptized death transformed from within. To quote Lewis himself, he has forced open a door that had been locked since death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the wild, beautiful, divine reversal. What was once the devil's weapon has been turned into God's triumph. The bait was taken, the trap was sprung, and death itself has died. Beautiful as that is, if you're like me, you still have some questions. Mainly, is death the devil's work? Why does God use death as a curse? Christ changes death from the inside? And these core things all spawn from a right heart of trying to understand what Christ is doing, so don't be afraid of questions. Let's tackle these really quick as we close. Is death the devil's work? Not directly, but the fathers do say the devil wields death. So we know that chaos can be wielded. It is abused by those who are agents of chaos. Anything good, either through privation or abuse, can be used for evil. In Hebrews 2:14, it says that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, that is, the devil. The power of death is not just physical, it is the spiritual. You got to understand the spiritual essence of this whole thing. The devil has no creative power, but through temptation and deceit, he introduces sin, and sin brings death, Romans 5:12. So the devil is like a parasite. He feeds on the freedom of the creature, twisting it towards death. St. Irenaeus writes, the devil, having become apostate, has enslaved man through fear of death, drawing him away from God. So while God allows death as a boundary and judgment for sin, Satan manipulates that reality to enslave, accuse, and isolate man from God. He wants everybody spiritually dead because it removes them from God. Why does God use death as a curse? Death is not only punishment, it becomes medicine. That's what we just talked about with what Christ did. St. Gregory says this, God in his justice banished man from paradise, but in his mercy he made death the cure, lest sin should become immortal in man. That's on the Holy Pascha. I mean, that's amazing. So even the curse contains mercy. God permits death to prevent the eternal living out of the corruption. It is a limit, not a stopgap to sin's endless decay. It changes death from the inside. This is why the incarnation matters so much. Christ enters not just into life, but into death, and not just a physical death, but the whole existential estrangement it symbolizes. But unlike Adam, he does not sin. So his death becomes the antitype of all deaths. Death dies in him. By death, he trampled death. That is the Byzantine liturgy. By death, he trampled death. Death isn't just beaten, it's baptized. It's no longer the end, but the beginning. Lewis puts it this way in the last battle. What has happened to you is not the end of the story. It is a chapter before the chapter that never ends. It's beautiful. Now we could get into questions like why physical death always why was it there? Was it part of the plan? But we'll potentially do that in another video. What I want you guys to understand is what I'm understanding in a deeper way, which is the beauty of the incarnation and the horroring of hell and the resurrection, and exactly what that means for death in this life. So I hope that video did this for you.